Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the May monthly policy update. People are just gathering. We'll give folks just a moment to get ready. It is too nice outside in Washington, D.C. to delay your Thursday afternoon fun any more than is necessary. And let me just underscore that the stuff we're going to talk about today is necessary, is critical to the work of the nonprofit sector and the work that we all do together. So I will again welcome everyone to the May monthly policy update. Good afternoon. I'm Ben Kershaw. I'm the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations here at Independent Sector. If you're joining us for the first time on an IS webinar, I want to welcome you. Independent Sector is a national membership organization made up of nonprofits, foundations, corporate giving programs working to ensure all people living in the United States can thrive. This is a webinar, and so as part of our webinar feature, your lines are muted. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A function at any time. We will pause periodically to answer them. You are welcome to put comments and general banter in the chat as well. This webinar is generally a membership benefit for independent sector members. If you are not an IS member, please stick around. And if you want to get connected with our membership folks, we will be happy to do that. Before we start, I want to respectfully acknowledge I'm joining you today from Washington, D.C. It is the ancestral home of the Piscataway people who are still in the area working to reclaim their land and their traditional practices. Also, many of the buildings and the places that we inhabit in Washington were built by enslaved people. So wherever you are joining us from today, welcome. We're really glad to have you. I am really glad to have with me our trusted partner and colleague at Washington Council Ernst & Young, Wes Coulomb, to give us an update on the federal landscape and some key issues. We will turn to that in the second half of our program this afternoon. First, we are also excited to have with us a special guest today, Nick Robinson from the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. Nick serves as a senior legal advisor there, and his work focuses on the organization's US program. So he works on things like the right to protest and how foreign influence laws can undermine civil society. We have a lot to talk about with Nick, in particular this month. So Nick brings a great degree of expertise on these issues, and I see that he's queuing up his slides now. So I will spare you all the lengthy bios and awards, feathers in Nick's cap, and just let him get started. You have access to his full bio on the website. So again, Nick, thanks for being with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you for some updates.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and thanks for having me here with Independent Sector. Always a pleasure. I'm Nick Robinson. I'm with the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. I manage the US program. And we've been tracking a number of different kinds of threats to the nonprofit sector. I think Manuel might actually drop in the chat here. We recently had a piece on kind of 10 major legal threats to the nonprofit sector, if you want to take a look at that for just kind of broader background. But one concern has been kind of the impact of foreign influence laws on the sector. And this is particularly coming up right now in this congressional environment. And I'm going to speak quite a bit about HR 8290 and 8293, which just went through the Ways and Means Committee. But I want to kind of preface that with a broader discussion about why we're seeing this right now. If I can get my computer to go to the next slide. I seem to be frozen out, sorry. Oh, there we go.
Looks good.
Okay, made it through. I don't know why my arrow wasn't working, but So just kind of some background on this is, why are foreign connections in the crosshairs right now? So there's a lot of discussion on the Hill and in Congress around terrorism, around election interference, around energy security. And a lot of this is coming out of things very much in the news right now. So with all the pro-Palestine protesters, that protest that we've been seeing around the country. There's a discussion about, by some on the Hill, particularly Republicans on the Hill, about whether they're connected or supporting Hamas or other terrorist organizations in one way or the other. There's also a longstanding and bipartisan concern about Chinese interference or Russian interference around elections or around kind of the public square in general. Same with Iran. And so I want to preface all this by saying, look, there's legitimate concerns, I think, out there around foreign influence, around terrorism and national security. But I think one of the main takeaways from my short chat today is that these concerns can also be weaponized against the nonprofit sector, and they can also just lead to bad policy. And I think you'll see examples of both of that, where either it's purposefully being weaponized or it's just kind of thoughtless policy, kind of in the name of going after these foreign concerns. So I wanted to start by talking about a cluster of bills that had gone through House Ways and Means Committee recently. One of which was HR 8290, which is a Foreign Grant Reporting Act. This went through Ways and Means Committee unanimously. It would require 501c nonprofits to provide public information on their 990s about all their foreign grantees. So if you're a domestic nonprofit, you might be thinking, how does this impact me? Or don't I already have to give this information because I give information for domestic grantees? That's correct, but it's not correct for those who work abroad. And so why might this be a problem? This has been making a lot of waves in the human rights community, in the environmental community, in the humanitarian community. And that's because there's very real security concerns about disclosing this information. So you can think about if you're working with Uyghur Muslims in the diaspora community in a third country outside China, if you're working on LGBTQ issues in Uganda where they have an anti-LGBTQ law, if you have to publicly list everyone who's your grantee, this creates real security concerns. And it's already being called by some like the kill list bill, right? That by folks in the humanitarian community, that just creates a kill list for China, Russia, Iran, and others to go after those that U.S. nonprofits might be funding on human rights and other issues. This came out of the bill was introduced out of concerns around terrorism funding and concerns that there might be 501Cs in the U.S. providing money to, for example, like Hamas adjacent organizations. This is really coming out of Israel's invasion of Gaza and the politics out of that. And also was one of the other justifications that was given was that there was some federal government funding that was given to a 501c3 that then gave a grant to the Wuhan lab in China. And so there's concerns, particularly among those on the right on the Hill, that there needs to be transparency around this funding. I don't think anyone who voted for this bill realized that it might endanger human rights and environmental and other activists around the world. That said, it passed unanimously, and so we're quite concerned about it getting attached to other bills, about it coming up for a floor vote, and then setting a bad precedent if a number of members are forced to vote on this bill, which at first glance just kind of appears like a transparency bill. There's also some other bureaucratic concerns with this. The bureaucratic concerns. Which slide are you seeing? You're on A290, right? Sorry, my screen's got messed up on the, yep. It also covers other assistance and indirect contributions are covered under the act or under this bill. And the concern is, like, what does that mean? Like, what is an indirect contribution or other assistance? So, for example, if a nonprofit provides a security training uh, to folks in a sensitive country context, would they then have to report everyone they give that security training to, because that's an in-kind contribution? So there's also just kind of a lot of vagueness around the language. This, though, goes along with a lot of other kinds of concerns around terrorism and foreign funding on the Hill right now. And I think Manuel will put some links in the chat here. So some of you already know about HR 6408, which passed the House and is kind of sitting in the Senate right now, which would allow the Treasury Secretary to terminate the tax exempt status for terrorist supporting organizations. This, I think civil rights, civil liberties groups are concerned, and I know independent sector and others have spoken out on this as well, because two things. One, it's unnecessary. Already, it's criminal to provide support to terrorist organizations. Two, through executive order, you can already strip tax exempt status for terrorist supporting organizations, and that has happened in a handful of contexts in the past. And so the concern is now you can have the Treasury Secretary do this as well. And so it just adds another vector, another way this can be done when we just have a really politicized climate around these issues, particularly with the issues with what's going on in Palestine at the moment, but you could imagine in other contexts as well in the future. We've also seen coming out of concerns of the pro-Palestine protests, some other concerning developments. So I think was put in the chat, there's a May 14th letter that was sent by Chairman Comer of the House Oversight Committee in Congress, requesting from the Treasury Secretary suspicious activity reports for 20 nonprofits and funders who are supposedly involved in the Palestine protests. If you want to look at the letter, it's an interesting list. It includes everybody from the Gates Foundation to RBF to OSF to some of the groups that have been involved with the Palestine protests. So really kind of a large number of groups and some prominent names. And I think there's a concern here because it sounds bad. You probably don't know what a suspicious activity report is unless you're kind of working in kind of money laundering circles. It sounds quite bad if you have a suspicious activity report. But these are given out anytime a financial institution thinks that there might be something that triggers potential like money laundering issues. I looked it up in 2022, there were over 3.6 million suspicious activity reports that were put in with the Treasury Department in 2022. So this is something that happens quite routinely. It would not be surprising at all if one or multiple of kind of the 20 organizations had these suspicious activity reports. But again, it kind of goes to these kind of aspersions we're seeing on folks in the nonprofit sector. There's also a letter from April 24th from the House Ways and Means Committee that was signed by all the Republican members of the House Ways and Means Committee to the IRS that caught a lot of folks' attention, and I think for good reason. It was specifically concerning concerns around foreign funding to the People's Forum, which has been involved in some of the pro-Palestine protests, and also the China Energy Foundation. And happy to talk about those two instances, but what I think is of more concern, if you look at the link to the letter, is the questions they ask at the end. And the questions are kind of more germane and perhaps point to the direction that the committee might be going.
So,
Yeah,
Nick,
go ahead.
I will encourage folks to check out that letter. Just FYI, Nick, we're looking at slide 2 at the moment. So if there are other things that you want people to see on the slides, I know
So my
we've got
slides are
important links to
moving.
dig into.
I don't know why they're not.
Okay. We
Let me
can
just see.
that looks great.
Apologies for that. Let me just share one more time, and then I will see if I can do. I'm not quite sure.
That looks beautiful.
Do you see the numbers 640, the HR 640? Sorry about that.
Yep.
Challenges of PowerPoint in these presentations and multiple screens. So that that summarizes the April 24th letter. I would go to the questions at the end of that letter, which I think alarmed a lot of people in the nonprofit community, because it asks things about like, how does the IRS determines what activities qualify for an exempt purpose? What activities are counter to a public purpose? What activities are quote are anti-Semitic? And it seems to be pointing to a direction where Ways and Means is interested more and more in kind of legislating, and at least providing oversight on when the IRS is providing tax exempt status or not. And I think the concern here is that organizations that are engaged in kind of disfavored activity by potentially whoever's in power might find that their tax exempt status comes into jeopardy because it's not, it's counter to public policy, or it doesn't qualify for an exempt purpose, or at least there's a lot more scrutiny there. And this is a marked shift that we've seen where I think for years, particularly after the Obama administration and kind of the controversy over the Tea Party and the IRS providing more scrutiny on, or allegedly providing more scrutiny on kind of Tea Party applications for nonprofit status, Republicans really backed off of, and were really concerned about IRS weaponization in political ways. And this letter seems to signal perhaps an openness or a willingness to start using the IRS and kind of tax exempt status in a more aggressive way of enforcement. Next slide, I'm going forward. And I'll try to catch up with myself here. I just got a couple more slides. The other piece of legislation that just went through the Ways and Means Committee that is of concern to us is HR 8293, which has a couple components. There's one component which would increase penalties for IRS officials disclosing information, and would also bar federal government from collecting donor information not authorized in the statute. There's another component of this bill, which has to do with foreign funding transparency. And that's the component that we're more concerned about. And so that would require nonprofits to report all foreign donations they receive in aggregate by country. And I think there's really three concerns here. So let's say you have 2 or 10 donors from Canada each year. You'd have to put in your IRS form Canada, and then all of that donation information and how much money in aggregate. So I think there's 3 concerns. One is there's a compliance burden. So now you have to start keeping track of where all your donations are coming from, which just can be difficult and create costs for organizations and costs in accounting, that sort of thing. Second, there can be a stigma potentially for receiving money from certain countries. So depending on your politics, for example, if an organization is receiving money from Israeli foundations, maybe that doesn't go so well in like progressive circles or certain progressive circles. So then do you refuse that money? Do you not refuse that money? Right? It creates those kinds of concerns. And then third, as I'm going to talk about shortly, there's always a question: if you're receiving foreign money, why are you not registering under the Foreign Agent Registration Act? And we and others have been pushing back against kind of aggressive FARA readings, but it allows others perhaps who are hostile to your work to go to the federal government and say, look, they're receiving foreign money. Why aren't they registering under the Foreign Agent Registration Act? And at least create noise or problem for folks. And I think that's particularly of concern in kind of this politicized environment we're in. And then I'll just kind of, on the legal points, I'll kind of end on this point, which is around the Foreign Agent Registration Act, where we've continued to see an activity around this, where I won't get into too much detail about this, but it's a really kind of overbroad World War II era act that was originally designed to shut down Nazi propaganda during the war, went into a kind of a relative period of hibernation until the 2016 presidential election, where it was brought back out to go after, concerns around foreign influence from the Russian and Chinese, but it's drafted in this really broad way. So I'll just give one example. So the Justice Department required a church in Pennsylvania to register Why did they have to register? Because they had foreign congregants coming in from France for a March for Life rally in Washington, D.C. And they asked that members of the church to print out posters or signs in advance. And they said, look, you need to register. Justice Department said you have to register because you're acting at the request of a foreign principal, your foreign congregants in France, to engage in a political activity in the United States to attempt to sway public opinion. And you're doing so at their request, which is that language in the act, which creates an agency relationship under the act. So you can see just from that one example how broad it can be. Right now, kind of enforcement of the act, I think DOJ's enforcement priorities is more on foreign government lobbying, on some, on Russia, on Saudi Arabia, on some of these other areas. But you can read it incredibly broadly, potentially even like unconstitutionally broadly. So we and a number of other groups and a number of the umbrella groups have been pushing in Congress for a long time to attempt to kind of narrow and amend the act to narrow the language. But in the meantime, we've seen these more congressional investigations on this front. So for example, right now, the House Natural Resources Committee has opened an investigation against environmental nonprofits that they claim have foreign influence. So right now they're looking at the League of Conservation Voters for accepting money from the Weiss Foundation, which, as you might know, is a Swiss foundation, and so can become a foreign agent in that way. And Code Pink, who received money from Roy Singham, who's an American billionaire based in China. We also have House Oversight has declared that they're exercising oversight over FARA and how the Justice Department is enforcing it. In last year, House Oversight Representative Comer had sent a letter implying that the NRDC, Rocky Mountain Institute, Climate Imperative Foundation, Rewire America, and others should potentially register under the act. So we see this kind of weaponization of FARA right now. Over 2 years ago, the Justice Department put out a notice for public rulemaking saying they were going to have new draft FARA regulations that they were going to be releasing. We and others, including the independent sector, submitted comments at that time. We've all been expecting these new draft regulations for quite a while, including at the beginning of this year. They might still come this year. It's getting close to the election, so I don't know if they're going to, but that's something we're watching. And certainly, if you care about FARA, you should be watching that space and when these draft regulations might be coming down. And then just the last slide and kind of concluding main takeaway point here is that, we've got these heightened concerns about foreign influence. At the same time, we have heightened political polarization. And so we just have this real risk of kind of weaponization and bad policy. And I think we're seeing that playing out on the Hill right now. And so I'll end and stop my sharing if I can figure that out. Here we go.
Thank you, Nick. And those slides were great. I'm so glad we got to see them. And if you'd like to share them out with folks later when we send around this recording, we'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, and apologies for the slide mix-up.
No problem. So we will pause now for questions. These are important topics. These are also dense topics for people to dig into if they're not deeply cited on them already. Nick referenced some, that independent sector and that, other like-minded and similarly situated organizations also had concerns about these two bills. And we have shared those concerns with the leadership of the Ways and Means Committee and leadership in Congress. I'll say that we are concerned, as Nick noted, about the potential for these bills to move through the House unless legislators understand that there are concerns from our community and others about them. So we would, as Nick noted, hope that folks can engage on this and stay in touch if there are ways that you think your organization might be impacted by this. Or if you want to be in touch with your legislators, we'd be happy to help with any of that. So Nick, I have a question for you, sort of about what you've noted some kind of themes that might potentially come next and that might be driving some of this focus. Do you have any more either information or speculation about the future of these two bills in particular? I know that you're a subject matter expert, but you also testified to Congress. You know your way around those halls as well. Do you have any further thoughts about kind of outlook or crystal ball type stuff?
So I think there's, yeah, two things. So one is HRI 290, which is about uh, for having to report foreign grantees. So organizations have to report who they give money to abroad. And that cleared Ways and Means unanimously. So all these bills were introduced like 48 hours before they went to markup. So there was very limited time to engage. And I think some members, quite honestly, were like voting without truly understanding, that they were putting human rights activists at risk around the world and that kind of thing. I think the problem that we face on that bill is, I think folks are beginning to understand the concerns about it. But it gets lodged in around, these issues around like Hamas and Palestine and Israel, right? Which are really hot button issues. And so if they kind of get put into that cloak, it's very easy for them to get moved forward, particularly since it went unanimously out of markup, and get attached. It's not clear to me, if it goes to a floor vote eventually, it could also put members in a really awkward position on voting on it, because it's hard to explain necessarily to their constituents. And so I think we're really worried, as I said, I think if it gets attached to something, or if it, makes it over to the House, I think it could get killed in the Senate. We're also worried about what it means if it gets reintroduced next Congress, right? Even if we can kill it, if we have all these members who are on record of voting for it, that it might move forward. On 8293, we're also quite concerned. So this is about foreign grantees, or foreign funding into organizations. That went through markup on basically partisan grounds, but it didn't do so. The concerns Democrats expressed weren't around providing disclosure for foreign funding. It was on the other aspects of the bill. And so we're worried about that one coming back and also kind of getting linked in on these FARA issues. And my sense is there's an appetite on Ways and Means now to keep introducing these bills. So even if we're able to like successfully push them back this time, they might come back. And so I think that's why it's all the more important to have a kind of a show of force this time around, to make clear that there's kind of a broad section of folks who are concerned about this, that it's not just, folks who are doing environmental work or LGBTQ issues in Uganda, but also religious freedom issues, anti-trafficking issues, right? Like things that folks on both sides of the aisle care about, that it's going to affect that set of issues. But we'll see. I mean, as you know, some of the nonprofit issues are kind of lower profile, so they can get stuck in on things that then get passed. And I think that's our big fear right now.
Thank you, Nick. So I had one other question for you. Is there on either of these bills, is there a de minimis threshold where, if you're not getting a whole lot of money from foreign people who happen to be from another country, or if you're only funding a little bit of foreign work, surely there's an exemption for people who
There's
aren't
not
doing a
on the
whole
grantee,
lot?
but let me, I can put it in the chat. I just don't have it at my fingertip on the received donations, because there is de minimis this there, both for receiving foreign funding, both the size of your organization and I think the amount. So if you're just like a tiny whatever organization, you're not going to, but it's going to capture a lot of the bigger organizations. And I'll just put that in the chat after, so you don't have to make me, as I'm not going through the bill.
Yeah, I think it's a $200,000 limit. So de minimis limit, anything under that, you're not required to disclose. Above that, you would. Yeah. Hey, Nick, quick question on these bills. I know there's issues with them, but anything I think from the sector standpoint can be constructive and willing to work with committee on going forward as far as enhancing disclosure. I know there's problems with some of this foreign disclosures, but the issue that the committee has raised is, I agree with you, not going away and could come back again. So I'm just, thinking about what we could do to kind of help, do something to advance their interest, but also make sure the sector is protected and things don't go too far. As you point out, it can get too, too overly broad and too much that impacts the sector's operations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, so for example, on the foreign donations in, right, I think they're just asking for from the country, but I think there's an accounting issue there, right? There's just a bureaucratic burden. And then I really think we got to figure out the FARA stuff. And this is why it's really important to have comprehensive FARA reform, because otherwise it just like sets everyone up who receives foreign money to be a target from their political opponents for a FARA investigation of like, hey, X organization, received some money from France. Why don't you go and investigate it? Why isn't the DOJ like looking into whether or not that rises to the level of being a foreign agent? And until we have kind of clarity on the FARA stuff, right? And there is a question under FARA, if you're receiving foreign money from abroad, whether you should be registering under FARA, which is a whole other kind of conversation. And the DOJ has given really mixed signals on that front, to be honest, and has been quite unhelpful, I would say, of having, bright line rules. And then on the other aspect, and so there might be a space there, right, down the road of like what disclosure does make sense, particularly once we kind of get FARA sorted out. On the second is, how do we make it work around these real genuine safety concerns, about disclosing grantees? And, US Aid and State has a system already. So anybody who receives money from US Aid and State who's a nonprofit who then regrants to another organization abroad, there's a system, all of that's on the US Aid and State website, all the subgrantees are, but you can apply, right, to have the information made confidential and not made public on the basis of national security or on the basis of safety. Now, that's one thing for state and USAID grants. It's a whole other thing to think about, a church is giving money, or nonprofits giving, a faith-based nonprofit is giving money abroad. Do they now have to go to the US government and ask for an exemption because they think it might jeopardize the safety of one of the groups they're working with somewhere? Do we really want the US government in that business? Is there a potential for weaponization of that with different administrations, right? If they want to go after LGBTQ organizations in Uganda, this would be a pretty easy way to do it, and just kind of disclose those lists out. So I think they're complicated issues. I do think there's a place to engage. I don't think the way that markup went is the way that there should be. If you're going to do this, there should be a hearing. There should be a way to kind of engage all the stakeholders. And so at the very least, we're asking for them to like kill this bill, and we can continue to engage down the road, but this clearly isn't the way to do it, we don't think.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Sorry.
I was just going to note before we move on, Nick, we have a question that came in through the Q&A about whether you've seen bills or efforts around how 501c3s are receiving federal funding and additional scrutiny based on some of these similar concerns. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't have information on that, and I don't know if you do, Ben, but historically, as you know, the IRS has been pretty hands-off on providing scrutiny, and kind of some people say two hands, right? That they haven't been able to kind of go after when money is being used, say, for political purposes and electioneering purposes by C3s. They aren't always as aggressive in that. But there's a real concern, and we work in 100 countries around the world, and one of the ways we've seen the sector get attacked in country after country is the weaponization of kind of the regulator for the nonprofit sector, one of which is the IRS here. And I think so far we haven't seen that recently, but the reason I think that Ways and Means letter concerns so many people, even if it doesn't result in kind of immediate action, is it seems to be kind of a shift in attitude of what the IRS should be doing, and what the role of the IRS should be in regulating what kind of nonprofit should qualify as a nonprofit and get those exemptions and not, and that there might be more politics infused in that in the future. So if others have other comments, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, I don't see specific bills on this. If anything, what the Ways and Means letters have said is that if you are a tax exempt organization, you are getting a benefit from the taxpayer already, and therefore we have, jurisdiction, and we can harass you or conduct oversight of you, or however you want to characterize it, whether you receive federal funding or not, right? You're already getting a tax subsidy. I think is one way to think about it. But and this is a larger conversation, and maybe it turns us to our appropriations update. But we have last year and even more this year seen increasing skepticism of federal funding, federal project funding going to nonprofit organizations in the way that House Republicans have set up their earmark process. So why don't we use that as a great chance to again thank Nick. Nick, you are certainly welcome to stick around and interject your thoughts on all number of tax policy issues. But again, I want to thank Nick, thank ICNL for being with us today, and for for all your work through the community year round.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. And I'll stick around, but I'll go off video.
So Wes, I mentioned that the appropriations process has been a little challenging for nonprofits this year. Can you give us a kind of a broader snapshot of what's happening on appropriations and other nonprofit issues in Congress?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Happy to provide a quick update on what's going on in the legislative front this year. The House and Senate are out this week for Memorial Day week recess, but back in session next week, both the House and Senate. They've pretty much finished most of the must-pass legislation for the year. The appropriations, as you know, for FY24, back a couple months ago, it passed the FAA reauthorization bill as well, signed it into law. They're kind of looking at now the next phase of work between now and September 30th, which really revolves mostly around trying to do the FY25 appropriations process in the House and Senate, as well as there's a farm bill they're looking to negotiate and try to pass the House and Senate by September 30th deadline, as well as the National Defense Authorization Bill that gets done on a regular basis, usually not till the end of the calendar year, November, December timeframe in past years. But that's also progressing and moving forward the legislative process in the House and the Senate. On the appropriations process, as we kind of went through, a delayed, grueling process and finally got it done, with the House and Senate and the White House. They've now begun, mainly in the House, to put together appropriations bills. New appropriations chairman, Republican chairman Tom Cole is already moving forward. Kind of said he's going to have the appropriations bills kind of keyed off of last year's numbers that were agreed to in the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act on a bipartisan basis, and kind of use those as a basis without any of the side deals, which actually basically means that they're going to try to end up, increasing defense spending, and also then probably compared to where they were before, look at possibly cutting non-defense spending as they write their appropriations bills. So looking to what the House is going to do, they're going to move forward on individual appropriations bills. The appropriations subcommittees already done a couple of them thus far, and have a schedule already laid out for the next month or so to pass those to the committees, and then with the idea to move them to the House floor later on this summer. Those bills will be, as I mentioned, much lower in spending amounts on non-defense side. So Democrats will oppose those bills. It will be a partisan exercise. Republican only votes in the committees for the most part, as well as on the House floor, given the numbers they put in there. And then we'll see what happens on the Senate side. The Senate is not quite organized yet on what they're going to do on appropriations. They've had some hearings, but not laid out a markup schedule for the bills. They have traditionally worked on a bipartisan basis in the Senate, with Senator Murray and Senator Collins working well together in the past Congress to move some appropriations bills in the Senate on a more bipartisan basis. So we'll see how that plays out as well. I think they still have to kind of get their schedules teed up and the numbers they need to work out before they can move forward on the Senate side. So, all that moving separately, the House and Senate. Then the question is, can they come together on some final appropriations bills before September 30th? The answer probably is no. They're going to be far apart on that. And so we expect them to probably, push the issue past the election, another CR scenario after the election in November, and deal with it towards the end of the calendar year. As you mentioned, the community projects are also very important. The earmark process in the House, Chairman Cole came out with some revised guidance with limited and narrowed the earmarks or community projects that they could put in the various bills. And so the opportunities will be more limited in the House. The Senate is basically following the guidance from last Congress or last fiscal year. And so we'll probably see more projects in the Senate side going forward. So it's something to watch as the process moves through the House and the Senate. Obviously, there'll be a big fight in getting those appropriations bills done in the fall. And potentially we could see, like we did this year, where it kind of bled over into the following year, and not get done on time. But kind of definitely watching that process. So organizations that are engaged in that need to continue to push forward with their projects and push forward with their requests for funding. Most of the deadlines have passed for submissions in the House and the Senate, even before the bills are being drafted. So kind of watching the process that goes through in the House and Senate. On the tax front, the larger tax bill that would extend some business provisions, that expand also the child tax credit that passed to the House on a bipartisan basis, is still pretty much stalled in the Senate due to Senate Republicans' opposition to the package. The House did pass recently, before I left town last week, a piece of that bill dealing with disaster relief. Congressman Stubbe from Ohio pushed for that, mainly because you have some provision in there dealing with the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, to allow funds they receive of that to be tax-free and not taxable. So that's unlikely, however, to move individually. I think Senator Wyden and the Senate Democrats want to kind of hold that to kind of push for a vote on the bigger package in the Senate. What Senator Schumer has not promised, but indicated possibly might happen before I leave town for the August break. And so I could imagine you might see that happen at some point next month or two on that bill. However, unless they agree to modifications or changes, I don't see the Republicans coming around and voting for that package. So unlikely to get the votes, CD votes necessary to move that forward. And then going to Nick's great presentation on the bills that passed out of Ways and Means on the foreign grants, et cetera. That a couple of those bills, as he mentioned, were reported out on a bipartisan basis unanimously in the committee. I think people are getting educated on the impact of those bills, but still, we could see at least the ones that are on a bipartisan move to the House floor at some point in the next work period, June, July, September timeframe, potentially, and see how that goes going forward. So I think it's important. The letters went up to the Hill to educate members about the impacts of those provisions as it moves to the process. I don't not heard of any additional comparable process or interest on the Senate Finance Committee side. So I think it's more of just a House exercise at the moment, but we will see how it progresses through the process. Obviously, you have Congress starting to really think about what's in the future, what's ahead, and that really is the 2025 expiration of most of the individual tax cuts that were passed in 2017. So all the individual rates revert to the lower levels that they were prior to 2017. You have the standard deduction going back down. You have the state tax limits being reduced. You have some business provisions coming into play on the international side, although the corporate tax rate was made permanent, so that's not going to change automatically. You also have individual provisions. You have the personal exemption that was suspended coming back unless they decide to repeal that. The state and local tax deduction cap of $10,000 will also expire in 2025 and come back. Itemized deductions as well. So that's a lot of tax issues on the table for 2025. CBO put out a report recently that said extending all the tax cuts from 2017 that expire would cost close to $4 trillion to make all of them permanent. So we're expecting a large tax debate to take place in 2025 in that environment. Obviously, how that shapes out will really be guided by the elections, who's in the White House, who controls the House, who controls the Senate, committee gavels, etc. Will kind of shape how that process plays out. In anticipation of that, we've already seen Chairman Smith, the Ways and Means Committee, form 10 tax teams with the various members of the Republican members of the committee to look at and examine different issues, working families, the workforce, new economy, global competitiveness, innovation, things of that nature, community development. And they're starting to have some roundtables, meetings to intake and to receive comments. They opened up a email portal. People can submit written comments to the committee as part of this process. On the Senate side, we have Senator Crapo indicating that he is forming 6 different teams of Republican members to do similar type working groups / teams exercise. Recall, this also took place prior to 2017 and 2016, 2015, where they did it on a bipartisan basis in the Senate. For example, Senator Hatch and Senator Wyden at the time set up some bipartisan teams to examine different aspects of the tax code. So a similar exercise is taking place now in the House and the Senate, but more on a partisan basis to examine all these issues leading into 2025. So a lot of conversation, a lot of education, I think, needs to take place. And so if you have an interest in issues that are on the table, obviously the charitable deduction is something that the sector cares a lot about, some of the AGI limits, other things that impact the sector from the workforce standpoint, childcare, et cetera, the child tax credit, those sort of things. Now is the time to weigh in, to engage with Congress on these issues as they lead up to the 2025 debate on the tax bill. So I'm going to maybe stop there and kind of help you answer any questions.
Thank you, Wes. Yeah, and we'll be sure to share at least on the House side, they've made pretty clear, who's on those teams and how best to get in touch with them. So that's information that we'll make sure to share out with you all. I will pause for questions, but just looking at the time that we have, I want to make sure that we cover some other updates, and then we will come back to questions. So since our last regularly scheduled monthly policy update webinar, the Biden-Harris administration has finalized the overtime rule that we had discussed when it was preliminary, and that hopefully many of you joined our special webinar about that a few weeks ago. So that rule is now final. The salary above which an employee absolutely must earn in order to potentially be exempt from overtime will go up from about $35,500 to almost $44,000 a year on July 1st. And then on January 1st, that threshold goes up to about $58,500 for employees who meet certain duties tests. About a week ago, more than a dozen businesses and industry lobbying groups did file a long anticipated legal challenge to this rule, and they filed it in the Eastern District of Texas, which was also, I think, widely anticipated. So that lawsuit is pending now and something that we will be closely watching. If you are interested in more details about this proposal and some strategies for workers and employers to be thinking about, the IS newsletter has a good piece on it today that went out earlier today as well. Also, last week, data privacy legislation that does not exempt nonprofits from its requirements passed a key subcommittee in the House of Representatives. This is, this bill builds on a bipartisan draft that was introduced in the last Congress. This bill represents a bipartisan and bicameral deal between the Republican chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Democratic chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. So I will note that that bill has been updated and cleared that key subcommittee last week. Independent sector has issued a summary of that bill, including some concerns for nonprofit organizations. And we would note very encouragingly that one of those concerns, steps have been taken to address it. So we've been concerned that federated nonprofit organizations sharing data amongst each other under previous versions of this legislation, those would have been considered to be third-party transfers, so treated the same under this bill as two organizations that don't know each other and don't work together and don't share a same mission, sharing information. The new version of this bill seems to create an exemption for data that is shared between nonprofits in the same federated structure. Certainly doesn't solve these problems and concerns for every nonprofit, but something that I think we take at the very least as a clear sign that people are listening and people are willing to work with our sector while meeting these really important responsibilities. The last thing I want to flag before we pause for questions again is that last month the Office of Management and Budget issued the most substantial revision to the OMB uniform guidance in a decade. And these, changes include a lot of positive developments for the nonprofit sector for organizations that have federal grants, including raising the minimum indirect cost reimbursement rate from 10% to 15%, making notices of funding opportunity much more easily readable. So some good updates are being made, and we will share out again some more information about that in the links. So with all of that, we said we didn't want to keep you from this beautiful Thursday afternoon weather, but there is just so much critical content happening on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C., impacting our work and our missions. So I will pause again for questions about the appropriations process, about the tax bills, about overtime or data privacy. Otherwise, I'll turn it to Wes for any closing comments. I saw you off mute, Wes. Didn't mean to pick.
Yeah, happy to answer any question on things we talked about, but just on the data privacy legislation, as you mentioned, it was a subcommittee in the Energy and Commerce Committee, so it needs to still go to the full committee before it moves beyond that. During the markup, there was, even though it passed by voice vote through the subcommittee to the next step in the process, which is the full committee, there was, on a bipartisan basis, several concerns raised by both Democrats and some Republicans about the text and different issues in the bill they want to work on as it moves the process. So I think that they, to your point, Ben, there will be changes to the bills that moves the process to assuage some of the concerns that were raised both by private entities like in the private sector and others, as well as by members on the subcommittee who are part of that markup. So stay tuned for more action there, some more changes before it goes much farther in the process.
Thank you, Wes. Lots to do. With that, I want to again thank Wes Coulomb. I want to thank my colleagues at IS for helping pull this together. I want to thank Nick Robinson at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law for joining us today. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for getting up to speed with us and for the work you do day in and day out. Thanks again. Have a good afternoon.